Hi everyone. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Charlie Christenson, and this is my final lecture recital as I pursue a DMA in Jazz Voice Performance at the University of Miami's Frost School of Music. Today I'll be presenting my research over the past year or so into Etudes for Jazz and Contemporary Jazz and Contemporary Vocalists. The title of my study is a study of vocal technique through the development of 4 advanced etudes for jazz and contemporary vocalists. Before I kind of get more into this, I'll just say that this is my first time really streaming, so please bear with me if we have any technical difficulties. So let's get started. This is the basic overview of what we'll be going over today. So we'll start with an introduction where I'll discuss the purpose and scope of this study. Then we'll go over the methodology, so how this research has been done over the last year or so. That methodology also covers the composition of new etudes, which is the third section here, in which I'll go into further detail talking about some of the harmonic, formal, and lyrical considerations from these etudes. So there ended up being 4 etudes, and these center around the technical concepts of breathing, registration, onsets and tone, and agility. After that, I'll talk about some of my conclusions and ideas that I have for further research, and then I'll take your questions. Speaking of questions, because there's a little bit of a lag in YouTube, how the questions will work the best is that as I'm going, please feel free to leave any questions that you have in the comment section of this stream. I already see some of you making some comments. I really appreciate all the good vibes. So there'll be some time at the end for me to answer any questions you have. So we'll quickly define an etude. An etude is a short work intended to focus on one or more technical or musical facets of performance. In some cases, these compositions also demonstrate a composer's aesthetic. These are also known as a study, or in classical vocal music, a vocalise. Note the difference in spelling between what we normally talk about as jazz singers as a vocalise versus the kind of more classical vocal term for usually a song without words. So etudes are typically short and focus on one technical aspect, but they don't always do that. Sometimes they will try to incorporate multiple technical challenges inside of them. And sometimes they're actually supposed to be kind of like devoid of a compositional style. But generally speaking, when we think of etudes and when we hear people perform etudes, this is normally the case. This definition usually holds true. The purpose of this study is ultimately to develop new technical etudes for the advanced student of jazz and contemporary voice. And these etudes are also meant to be suitable for performance. So I'll talk a little bit more about both of those things. So first of all, the primary components of my doctoral essay were research into the etude and exploring this idea of writing etudes for jazz and contemporary vocalists. In order to limit the scope of my study, 2 things were really important. The first was that I was focusing on technique. So I'm not focusing on things that are common to jazz pedagogy or contemporary pedagogy, which is improvisation and style. Not that those things aren't important, it's just that there are other resources that are focusing on that. And so in order for this research to kind of find a little bit more of its own niche, and also to kind of like more match some of what I saw in classical voice etudes from the past, really focusing on technical study. This also limits my study so that I can get this done in a year or so. The other part of this is really thinking about what it meant for an etude to be performable. So that usually meant, I guess what I determined in the end was that meant that that these etudes should be similar in some characteristic to canonic repertoire in jazz and contemporary music. So that's usually in terms of form and harmonic content, and lyrical content. So I'm really thinking about these as being technical studies, but also applicable for performance. Transition now. So we can talk a little bit about my methodology in this research. So the first thing that I did, and really the first thing that everybody does when they're working on a doctoral essay for the most part, is a literature review. And I'll speak to that in a little bit more detail in a second. But the general idea of that is to figure out what's already out there and to learn, hopefully learn some best practices. So to get a sense of kind of like what's effective and what's not, and what the opportunities are. The next thing that I did, or the second component of the methodology, was a voice teacher survey. And the goal of this was to get a sense of what current voice teachers in jazz and contemporary voice were doing, and also what their general thoughts were about etudes and about technique and about the idea of composing for your students. So writing a piece for your students, either to perform or to develop in some sort of musical way. And then the last thing, the third component of this, is helpful exercises from voice technique resources. So these exercises that I will highlight later in this lecture are ones that really particularly inspired the composition of these new etudes. I took a lot of inspiration from a lot of different sources, and certainly looking at etudes in classical music and in jazz and contemporary music was very inspiring and gave me a lot of ideas. But because those are slightly different than what I ended up doing, I really kind of like broke it down to an even kind of like more fundamental level, which was looking at exercises from these technique resources that are used often in college courses on voice pedagogy and by other scholars. So that's the general methodology. Now we'll get into my literature review. In some ways, this is one of the bigger chunks, if not the biggest chunk, of my DMA essay, and there's too many potential sources and helpful sources out there to mention here. So I'm just going to mention a couple, just highlight a few things that were particularly helpful for me, and gave me kind of a sense, and hopefully give you a bit of a sense of what's out there. So we'll start with classical piano etudes. After that, classical voice etudes, jazz and contemporary etudes, and then finally voice pedagogy texts. Those are not in any particular order. That was just the way that I've organized this. So to start, classical piano etudes. I think this is where many people's minds go when they first think about the idea of an etude. I know certainly that's where kind of like I started with this research. Etudes in classical piano are still very commonly performed in recitals and in recordings, and these are things that we listen to all the time if we're listening to classical piano music. This really kind of like started this idea, particularly in France in the 19th century, with composers like Liszt, who were very inspired by the virtuosity of other instrumentalists, particularly like the violinist Paganini, and wanted to take some of that virtuosity and kind of like show it off a little bit more in piano music. This also coincided with a pretty big boom in normal people, or at least upper class people or upper middle class people, having pianos in their home and having interest in becoming better piano players, and showing off to other folks. So this kind of virtuosic thing that's happening in this kind of the 19th century is really highlighted with these classical piano etudes. Maybe potentially the biggest name when it comes to piano etudes is Chopin, and I don't know if you can read this if it's too small, but this Etude Opus 10 is kind of like widely thought of as the kind of most I don't know, important. I don't know if I can say that, but the most important etude of that kind of shows him taking one technical idea and developing that over time. Later on, many of what we consider this kind of canonic, classical composers have taken on this idea of the etude, particularly for the piano. So Debussy, Stravinsky, Bartók, those composers wrote etudes, and it was an important part of their writing. That's all I'm going to say about that. There's actually a lot of research and writing about classical piano etudes, so I'm not going to spend too much time talking about that. Classical voice etudes, similarly, at this time, were becoming more popular, and again with this idea of performing music at home, or just an interest in this kind of like performing music all the time. There was a big boom in the 18th and 19th century for voice teachers and for voice pedagogy. This is kind of the beginnings of voice science. So there were a lot of really important teachers that came out of this time. So which I'll talk about in a little bit more in a second. But some of the more kind of the more widely used etudes are those of Vaccai and Concone and Marchesi, that kind of all come out of a very similar sort of tradition of this like bel canto, like Italian style of singing. Not something that I'm necessarily like a big expert in, but these are the things that I looked at, and these are all still used today. One of the collections of etudes, of classical voice etudes that I've been using recently that I really like is this collection by Sieber, which is, I don't have a picture of him, but I have an image of his vocalises there in the middle. And he wrote a number of vocalises, and he has a couple texts that are 36 8-measure vocalises that are for each voice type are slightly different. He uses a altered version of solfege for these to kind of emulate kind of clear and easy to use Italian vowels or neutral vowels. So really nice collection. All of these are used by teachers of all styles, not just classical voice. Moving on to a little bit more of my area of study in general is jazz and contemporary etudes. So there are significantly fewer jazz and contemporary etudes that are widely available than there are classical, and potentially, and that's not probably super surprising, if for no other reason that jazz and contemporary music pedagogy is much newer than classical pedagogy. But a couple of things to highlight here. The first is a little bit outside the box, and this is Chick Corea's children's songs, which are these songs that he wrote that like some of these other ideas, or like these Chopin etudes, really develop from like one single idea, whether that's a technical idea on the piano or kind of like a more harmonic idea, rhythmic idea, but he'll develop these short children's songs. And what's really interesting and cool about that, about these children's songs, is that there's a written book of children's songs that anybody can buy and play, and then he's recorded these also. So there have been kind of commercial, artistic releases of these children's songs as well, both playing solo and playing duo with people like Gary Burton. Similar, in a similar kind of vein, or kind of from a similar place, are there's also Oscar Peterson etudes, and a number of other pianists and saxophonists. Moving on to Bob Mintzer. Bob Mintzer has a book of 14 jazz and funk etudes. What I'll say, I'm going to just like pause for a second and just say this here, that almost all, if not all, of etudes that are in this jazz and contemporary style are written with the intent of either developing style, so developing stylistic skill, like swing or walking bass line or comping or etc., or bebop lines, or they're developing, like bebop lines, developing language for improvisation. A pentatonic thing to use over a song while you're improvising. Very few of them focus on technique, even if the etude is technically challenging. It's not the primary goal of the etude. And in that vein, Dr. Lou Fisher's stylistic etudes in the jazz idiom is really written to kind of develop style on a number of different instruments. But there's an etude on walking bass lines and the blues and all that kind of thing in that text. For vocalists, again, it's mostly focused on improvisation and style. One of the best books in this area is Darman Meter's vocal jazz improvisation, and there are some other books like this, but his book is really great in the way that it's formatted and how much content is in that text. But there are others, and there are kind of more coming out as the pedagogy for jazz continues to develop. There are also some contemporary etude collections. There's a notable one for contemporary piano, but there are much fewer even than jazz, and again, they're almost exclusively focused on style. One of which I'm about to mention. So if I move on now to finally voice pedagogy texts. This was the area of my literature review in which there are probably the most resources, and so it became the most difficult to decide kind of what to include or what to focus on. And so I'll just highlight a few things here. The first is Manuel Garcia's Hints on Singing, and this is from the 1800s, from the 19th century, and it's really kind of thought to be one of the first, if not the first, voice pedagogy texts that kind kind of has the backing, a somewhat of a scientific backing, in addition to generally kind of talking about voice technique. His text, the Hints on Singing, is written in kind of a question and answer format, which some kind of more modern texts follow suit with. But there'll be questions like, so what does it mean to breathe for singing? And he'll kind of like mention it. It includes musical examples along with examples in text or discussions in text. After that, or kind of following that, about 100 years later, is William Vernard's singing text, and this is really thought to be really kind of a revolution in voice pedagogy or voice science, in the way that he's really incorporating physics and medicine and all these other fields besides music, and his examples. So an important text. I will say that the Marchesi text, the Bel Canto, is kind of like somewhere in between all of that, and that one is also very commonly used and has some great musical examples for sure. The one that was the most helpful for me, and a kind of the most, besides the contemporary thing, it was kind of the more modern take on this. So from I think this is published in 1996, but The Structure of Singing from Richard Miller was really probably for me the most helpful text. As you'll see as I continue to develop these etudes, it shows like a number of really great musical examples for every idea. So there are variations on almost all the exercises, and really clear explanations and discussions about what to kind of look for and what to think about while you're doing the exercises. And he breaks it down for different voice types and different kind of scenarios. So that one was particularly helpful. The last one I'm going to mention here, though, is Ann Peckham's The Contemporary Singer. And this is, so Ann Peckham is the chair of the voice department at the Berklee College of Music. And she has a couple of texts like this and articles that kind of take the angle from obviously the contemporary side of singing. There are a number of great exercises in this text, and there are some etudes at the end. The etudes at the end really focus on stylistic concerns, but what's really cool about them, and what's really particularly helpful for my project, is the formatting. It's like super clear formatting. There are examples of exercises for every etude. The etudes are written in different keys, presented in different keys, and there's play-along tracks and example tracks. So it's really a great model for these kind of sources going forward, just in terms of kind of like covering, I guess, what I would consider all the bases. So these are a couple things to consider if you're interested in this. This thing called voice pedagogy or singing. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the voice teacher survey. The goal of this survey was, again, to get a sense of what current teachers are doing with their students, and kind of what they're thinking about, and maybe to try to figure out a little bit what might be most helpful to them. This survey took place between January and February of this year. It initially, it was sent out to over 40 teachers, and 20 ended up participating in the survey from what I consider, and many consider, to be some of the top schools in the country, particularly when it comes to jazz and contemporary voice. Including the University of Miami's Frost School of Music. I'll just say thank you to if any of these instructors are watching right now. Thank you for participating in the survey. I'm not going to go through every question of the survey, but I'm going to discuss a couple key questions and the responses. So we'll start here with a big question. In your experience, what is the most successful way to develop vocal technique. This is what these voice teachers said. Ensemble singing or other, you can see here that a majority of the voice teachers felt that exercises derived from repertoire were the most successful way to develop vocal technique. 19% felt that repertoire was, and then a relatively small percent thought that etudes were the most successful way. I will say, though, that it is encouraging in some ways, particularly for me personally, that etudes showed up at all on this list. So that's encouraging that at least it's out in the world, even if it's not the most not considered maybe the most successful way. And certainly this is one of the reasons why it's really important, as you'll see, that I break the etudes down into exercises as well. The next question, I'm going to kind of try to speed up a little bit through this process. But the next question was, on average, how often do you use etudes in private lesson teaching? And 67% of these teachers said that never or sometimes they use etudes in their teaching, which to me makes me think that there is an opportunity here for maybe teachers to use etudes as a part of their thing if they haven't maybe considered it before. You can see that 13% said about half the time, only 7% said most of the time, and 13%. So I guess 20% of them are most of the time or always, which is also cool. So one of the great things about this survey, I'll just say as an aside, is that I think it's gotten people thinking about etudes a little bit in a way at a time maybe they weren't so much. The next question was to rank the technical concepts that I offer from most to least helpful included in a contemporary jazz etude designed to develop vocal technique. So the idea was is that they were able to rank from 1 to 5 what they thought the most helpful concept was and what maybe the least helpful might be to include here. And this was something that I thought was going to be super helpful for my project. I really had a lot. I had a lot resting on this question because my feeling was that, like, okay, the teachers are going to tell me what to do. They're going to say, like, you really need to do breathing. You really need to focus on this. And I think maybe I could have either given more options or thought about maybe asking this question in another way. It's not that it wasn't helpful, but the data ended up being slightly confusing. I had to kind of like really figure out how to make this useful. And what I ended up doing was taking the mean of each score for each technical concept and basically like golf, deciding that the lowest score meant that it got the most amount of high scores, either 1, 2, or 3. And so if you can just kind of tell by looking at this graph for a couple seconds, you can tell that like breath, tone, registration are things that kind of like, first of all, show up a lot for number 1, but also kind of show up quite a bit for 2 and 3 as well. What was really complicated, though, when I first started looking at this was that tone got both the most amount of number 1 votes and the most amount of number 5 votes, or like it got the most helpful votes and the most least helpful votes. And I think what that just means is that there's no one right answer to this, and that folks aren't concerned with just any one thing, that there really are a number of things that could potentially be helpful. The last question that I'm going to talk about here was the idea that these etudes could have lyrics or not have lyrics, and wondering which would be preferred. And a majority of instructors felt to this question that they would prefer etudes without lyrics. So 71% said without, and 29% said with. And that was just an issue with me hitting some sort of button. So I'm going to go to this. So I was really interested to know, are lyrics going to be helpful, or they might just get in the way? It seemed like when I actually drilled through the comments and figured out what people were saying without just kind of like the number analysis, that folks really felt that if they had had a third option, which was that they could do the etudes with lyrics or without if they wanted to, that they would prefer that as an option, which of course is an option. So what that means is that in the final version of these etudes, when they get published, I would give a suggestion to maybe some syllables or some vowel shapes that people could use, but leave it up to the instructor or the student to decide what they wanted to do. The reason why including lyrics was really important to me was this idea that the etudes could be performed. And I just felt that if they didn't have any lyrics, that would change it too much from what we're used to for kind of canonic repertoire in this field. So that's the fundamental part of my methodology. So literature review, teacher survey. Now I'm going to go into the actual etudes. At this point, I should just mention that there is a download link in the description of this YouTube video, and it was also in the Facebook event. So if you haven't downloaded the etudes before this point, this would be a really great time to download them if you'd like to follow along. Because I'm not going to be showing the full etudes on the screen, so you might want to actually follow along as I kind of show you a little bit about these. So the composition of the etudes, the first thing I'll say is that again, like my in addition to, I kind of had two main goals. The first primary goal is to we're going to want to head to technically, but the second part of it is really expressing my voice as a composer. So if you're familiar with my songwriting, my hope is that that some of these sounds and forms and lyrical forms and way of kind of talking or way of writing lyrics and melodies doesn't sound like I just copied and pasted things from other things or are just a bunch of vocal exercises stitched together, that it really does feel like an original song that you might hear somebody sing. The lyrics all have a slightly different focus, but the overall general focus of the lyrics is nature, which is good timing since it's kind of Earth Day week. But it's something that's always been really important to me and also been a very common topic for me in my writing. I was thinking a lot about not using the word I or not kind of like worried about maybe making the songs too personal so that other people might feel uncomfortable performing them, or they might be confusing or something in a way that I didn't want them to be. And so I'm trying to write these etudes in a way that could be pretty universal. So thus the idea of kind of like discussing nature, but are not necessarily like sterile or something. So it may be a pretty small needle to thread, but that's kind of the goal. That's what I'm going for here. So let me just jump into this. So we'll start with etude number 1, which is focused on breath. So the title of this one is Home Free, which we're going to get to in a second. But here's a Richard Miller quote. He says that almost any vocalese is a breath management exercise. Obviously, breath is fundamental to life. It's fundamental to singing. If the breathing doesn't feel good and isn't working in the way that we want it to, the other things that follow after that are not don't really matter all that much. So what I'm going to start, basically how I'm going to structure this part of it is that I'll go through some of the helpful exercises that kind of inspired the etude. I'll play the etude, hopefully pretty well, I hope. I'll do my best. They're still pretty new to me, and they're pretty challenging, so I hope it goes okay. And then I'll talk through a couple of the exercises that I developed after writing the Etudes that could potentially be used to develop some of these skills. So the first kind of helpful exercise that I'll mention here when it comes to breathing is this exercise from Richard Miller entitled Quick Renewal. And the idea of this is to regulate relatively quick inhalations without altering the position of singing. And probably you've seen some sort of version of an exercise like this in the past. And I'll just kind of give you an example of it. If we went like, that basic idea, you'll see this idea of quick renewal of breath energy, particularly in the second page of my etude that I wrote. The next thing I'll just mention is a combination of actually a lot of things. The first is just this idea of like long tones. So basically any wind instrument or vocalist is familiar with this idea of long tones. So taking a deep breath, deep low breath, and then singing with a consistent airflow. This one from Marchesi is an addition to it is this messa di voce, which is basically a dynamic swell. And every text that kind of talks about this idea mentions that you really shouldn't even attempt this until you've got some level of technical proficiency. The really tricky part of it, I find, is the decrescendo during like the second half of this exercise. But I'll give you a general sense of this. So if this is then we'll go up a half step, etc. And then we just keep going through that pattern. But that idea of messa di voce is very common in the Etude collections from classical voice teachers and also from these voice pedagogy texts. So now we'll move on to Etude number 1, which is entitled "Come Home," and you can follow along as I play this one for you. I will say there's a little bit more information in the handout too about the inspiration of these lyrics, so you can follow along with that or kind of get a sense of that. Come home, rolling still sees wild unknown. We are free, known all that we've known, heaped up and covered with stone, old friends we've outgrown, mistakes we've kept to ourselves. For their help, let it lay on like it knows more than it ought to, floating away, now struggling just to say we're happy to be home. It was hard out on our own, though we were free. Come home. alone, wild but numb, soft as stone. From where we come from, there's days we don't feel the sun, nights when we were young, days when we fend for ourselves, waste our health, far away now, like before, frozen docks, eyes strained against their posts, still grasping for the shore, like the springs not yet forgotten, breaking away, now struggling just to say we're happy to be home. It was hot out on our own, though we were free. We were free. We were free. We were free. Home free. Okay, so that's Etude. That's Etude number 1. I hope you enjoyed it. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about some possible exercises that could be derived from this. So the first one is very similar to the Marchesi exercise. The idea is that that we have a long sustained phrase with this messa di voce. So and then the idea would be that we could potentially transpose that up or down and kind of do the normal exercise. I wrote these with chords so that they would kind of emulate a song more closely, but obviously they could be simplified without chords. The next one is again this quickly paced renewal of breath energy. So this is similar to some of the melodic stuff in the Etude, particularly on the second page. This like ho 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 ho, and then you can move it up ho 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 ho. That kind of basic idea. Now we'll move on to the idea of registration. So here's a Paris Rutherford quote. Hopefully most of you know who that is. Really, a really important and well-known vocal jazz educator. He said, "Private lessons should focus on the voice, the building of the voice, and the combining of the voice. That is, eliminating the break and making sure the person has access to the total voice." A lot of the words voice in this presentation generally, but also in that quote. So now I'll talk about a few important exercises for registration. Registration is generally, I would say, a kind of complicated topic. There are a lot of opinions on this. So I'm going to use some terminology of head and mixed and chest register, although there are a number of terms that you could use instead. This first exercise, this inducing a head mixture into middle voice, this melodic kind of shape is basically the beginning of the next etude. It's slightly altered, but this was really inspirational for this one. And this is in this key. This is in a key that's probably a little high, but the whole idea is that you kind of bring your head voice down into the mixed voice a little bit. So if I move it down maybe to the key of D, all these registration things, it's really critical, obviously, that it gets changed into whatever key is going to be most helpful for each singer. The next one is from Estelle Liebling, who is maybe a little bit more of a music theater or contemporary voice pedagogue, but you've probably seen some version of this exercise with the syllable siya. So siya, and the idea is maybe to start in a mixed register and then transition to chest. Siya, etc. So you'll see a lot of these. Basically, this next etude is just a lot of transitions from these registers. So the inspiration for the lyrics of this etude is a poem by Percy Shelley called "The Cloud" from 1820, and in this poem, the cloud kind of has these sentient traits, and in my version of these lyrics, the cloud is kind of in love with the moon, and is really kind of in awe of the sun. So the sun is kind of its hero. Obviously, this is like a pretty obvious connection to registration, are kind of the clouds, or thinking about that when I started working on this. So here's etude number 2. Neath the glow, perched 1,000 feet below, ceiling no floor, the maiden moon, she asks as far too soon for more. In the breeze, flowing hushed above the trees, angels call to start her unseen feet, which rarely miss a beat of my heart. The fallen sky, the glow of starlight strung down from high, the stars gaze behind her while she flees over river and sea. I laugh to see them whirl slow, as if there's somewhere else to be, here with my moon. We've seen swift cliffs slow to rolling hill, nothing stays the same, though trapped above, the spirit that she loves always remains. Sunrise with its clear and fearless eyes burns on August throne. As starbeams hide in him, they can confide each unknown. In the dim, where volcano fires swim, bannered cape to cape, an endless roof, I bide their sunbeam proof without shape. The torrent seas, the mountain columns they used to be, the arch of a triumph we can't know, hurricane, fire and snow. We roar to feel them crash fast beneath us, as if there's somewhere else to be. Here with our sun, we is the same, though trapped above, the spirit that she loves always remains. Sun and moon, gone too soon for the clouds. Cool. So that's Etude number 2. I truncated a little bit, and I messed up some of the words, just like the last one. But I'm going to quickly, because I'm starting to run out of time, I'll just quickly mention a couple of these exercises that go along with this. This first one is a leap from mixed register to head. So, and obviously that would be in different keys depending on what best fits your voice. And then the next one is kind of an extension of this, so going from mixed head back to mixed. So that kind of an idea. And then the last one is really kind of two things combined. The first one is going from mixed to head back to mixed, and the other one is kind of going from mixed to chest. So this is do 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 do. That's kind of the first idea. Do 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 do. And then the next part of it is do do. So if you put it together, do 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 do. I really like that melodic shape, if you couldn't tell. But yeah, that's the last of the registration thing. I'm gonna really quickly go over onsets. So the correct attack should be conceived in the ear before the attack, says William Vernard. So some helpful exercises for onsets, which I don't really have time to talk too much about. To talk about onsets, but basically there are 3 types of onsets: aspirate or breathy, balanced, and then finally glottal. And balanced is the one that we want to go for most of the time. And one of the ways to practice that is to do lines that have staccatos. Onsets are important because they determine the tone that happens after that. Just like breakfast starts your day off right. I'll play just a little bit of Etude number 3 so you can get a sense of what this one is like. So this is like this. Each end is an illusion. Our apprehension, eyes up and open wide. Each end is an illusion, an ebbing in our mind. Knows no boundaries, no shore, knows no frontier that wasn't there before, knows no outline, right or wrong, just an answer, knows no ending, no golden dawn. And then it kind of goes back. There's a middle section there, but that's the kind of the general idea. What I was really thinking about in this one, I think what was really important to me was that the lyrics were set up and so that there were a lot of words that started with vowels, because consonants can kind of disguise the onset. Having lyrics that start with a vowel are kind of a clearer demonstration of the onset. So that was kind of the main focus with that. There's some other fun things in there that I wish I had time to play for you, but that's the kind of general vibe of that. If I look at, or if we look at some exercises for this, this is kind of the main melody idea. And then this is the kind of secondary melodic thing that you just heard with some more leaps. The no, 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 and then you could transpose it, no, 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 etc. So that's onsets. I'm sorry that one got kind of shifted a little bit. And along the same lines, I don't really have time to talk about the agility etude, but that's included in your handout, so you can take a look at that. But vocal agility is a freedom from muscular tension and reliance on steady air pressure. And so for this one, we'll see a lot of exercises like this. So a number of patterns. Do, you. This is something that jazz musicians are really used to seeing, because we learn a lot of these digital kind of patterns for use in improvisation. That one is from Manuel Garcia, and then here's another one from Ann Peckham, which is she has a lot of exercises pentatonic. So this is a kind of a D minor or F major pentatonic pattern. That kind of general idea. I'm probably going to go a few minutes over, obviously, because I do want to play a little bit of this one for you, just since I have all of your attention. This is Etude number 4. This has a lot of, basically Etude number 4 is mostly a study in descending kind of descending diatonic runs, mostly in kind of the Lydian mode, so you can kind of get a sense of this one. So this goes like this. So long it's misremembered if we tried, lost without our guide. I knew a place for us, a place I found you steady by my side. How willingly you match my stride. searching for some field and stream, how serene at peace, you and me. Longing for some fields and streams, space for this heart to be free. What's with this mind over matter, matter? Just look how easily we stay in the moment. We can stay in the moment, stay if we slow down, slow down, slow down, just slow down, slow down, 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 slow down. So that's the kind of general idea to bar 57. So it goes space. Oh, 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 open. Wide open space. Wide open space. Wide open. And that's kind of the general idea. These kind of runs and stuff is, for those of you that know me, is not necessarily the thing that I naturally do. So this was a cool, this has been really cool to kind of work on and spend a little bit more time on. So a couple exercises, along those same lines are just really just patterns, these kind of descending patterns and different shapes. I'm going to quickly now talk about conclusions and next steps. So the big conclusions I had that for me personally, coming away from this study and this research and this work, is that there are actually a lot of really great resources out there that I wasn't aware of. There are a number of really cool classical voice etudes and etudes in jazz and contemporary voice. But at the same time, there's opportunity for people that maybe want to do some of this. I think there's a lot of opportunity for voice teachers or for teachers in general in jazz and contemporary music that want to write music for teaching purposes, or at least somewhat for teaching purposes. And so the goal with this is that, I had these 4 etudes. In the process of writing these etudes, I made a number of sketches, and some etudes actually got pretty close to almost kind of being finished before I chose these. And so the idea would be that I would take those and maybe continue to develop this idea and edit this idea, and then present a text of advanced etudes for voice. And then, for me, the reason why I decided to go and focus on advanced etudes was, first of all, that was kind of what the most interesting idea was for me at the time, and also it matched how I feel about this. The students that I work with now. I feel like I'm used to mostly teaching college students, and so the idea of kind of developing something for them that would be technically challenging, that might be kind of set up in a kind of sequential way, or that was clearly illustrated what the technical challenge of this is, and maybe some of the ways to approach it. That was kind of the most interesting thing for me at this time, but a goal would be to kind of fill in those other gaps. So write etudes for beginning students and maybe intermediate students. Potentially write some shorter etudes that could be put together in a collection, and then maybe even take some. Now that I kind of have developed this format, take songs that are existing and kind of put them in this format and discuss a little bit about, or kind of illustrate the ways that the technical challenge they present, and maybe some ways to approach that. So that's the further research. There's still a lot to learn and a lot to know about this. But that's what the last year or two of study has yielded. So now is time for any questions that you have. I haven't necessarily noticed any questions in the comment section. I have seen a lot of encouragement. It's hard, but when kind of on your own and working on these things with maybe just a few other people, it's really exciting to show maybe a wider audience, and it's a little nerve-wracking. So I really appreciate the well wishes and all of that. I will say I will just take this moment as if any other people want to write some more questions in the comment section. I will take this opportunity to thank my committee, especially Dr. Kate Reed, who has been my advisor and private teacher through this process. And she's really given a lot of time and expertise and mentorship to this, and so I want to particularly thank her, but also the rest of my committee, so Dr. DeVersa, Dr. Bergeron, and Dr. Ragsdale at the University of Miami. I want to thank my jazz vocal family at Frost, Allison Wedding, and all of my students and friends, all the people I've been in ensembles with, and I'm gonna miss you all a lot, and so I just want to say thank you for everything, and last of all, my friends and family who have put up with me as I've nerded out on all this stuff, and sometimes been really stressed out and sometimes been really preoccupied. So I want to thank you all. So it looks like I have a couple questions. So the first one was from, and forgive me if I missed a question. Forgive me if I've missed a question earlier on. So I'll start with Maddie Hart said, what are your thoughts on using Italianate vowels for CCM vocalese practice? CCM is contemporary commercial music, or basically thought of as like, contemporary music or commercial music, for those of you that don't know that term. And Italian vowels, I think you mean, I hope I am getting what you mean, but just kind of like the pure Italian vowels. And I think that that's really helpful and important. What I would say is that what's tricky about jazz and contemporary music, kind of expanding from that idea, is that in English, the vowels are so much not pure so often of the time. So I think actually some mix of those things. Like I've done a lot of exercises on kind of more neutral, kind of in between vowels, because of their similarity to things we sing in English. But I think that's a great place to start. In these Sieber vocalises, he uses this dame ne po tu kind of like version of, it's like dominization. It's just this idea of kind of like taking solfege syllables and kind of changing them up or clarifying them a little bit, or it's like another version of solfege. So something like that for the etudes might be kind of cool, at least maybe for the exercises. I hope I answered your question. It's really hard to tell without seeing like either you shaking your head this way or nodding this way, but I'll move on. So Allison Wedding asked if these keys are going to be available in different keys. Yeah, what you'll notice in the handout is that some of them say high voice or low voice. And so for my essay, I've actually included in my doctoral essay high and low versions of all of these etudes. And so that would definitely be a part of the etudes, as they get published. I think like I might try sticking to like high voice and low voice versus like tenor and soprano, mezzo, the soprano etudes in treble clef. But for jazz and contemporary singers, we primarily, for like lead sheets and stuff, we read treble clef. So I might just keep it in high or low keys. The other thing I had thought about is potentially making like Sibelius charts available, or I know there are other softwares online, like Music Notes use this kind of thing where you can put put songs in whatever key you'd like. So I would hope to maybe kind of create some sort of ability to do something like that eventually. Alex Brandenburg asked if you could use these etudes to talk about songwriting concepts in lessons as well. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I think about a lot in composition and just in creativity in general is this idea of kind of like giving yourself some limitations, so that so that you don't have like every option possible. And so this idea of for my writing in this process, I talked about some of my really specific limitations. I was influenced by vocal exercises. I was thinking about a specific technical sort of a thing, and ways that I could emphasize that or develop on that idea as much as possible. Lyrically, I was trying to like come from a place that would be interesting and authentic and all of that, not cliched, but not overly personal. But I think like this idea of writing etudes is something that in some ways is like a little bit of a lost art. In that we can actually, like, I've learned a lot about my own singing through writing these and figuring out like what was hard and what was easy, what can't I really do all the time consistently, and what can I do, and what does it mean to be advanced or beginner and all that kind of stuff. I think it's great as a teacher and also as a songwriter. I hope that answers your question. I have a question from Dr. Guerra. He said, thanks for watching, Dr. Guerra, by the way. That's really very sweet of you. So he's asking about how can a non-vocalist, specifically horn players, composers, maybe use these etudes. So the first thing I would say is that I think like a lot of times technical challenges are two things. They're both specific. They're whether or not you're a vocalist or a trombone player or a piano player. What I found is like playing the melodies of these etudes that I found specific technical challenges in the etudes. So like the agility etude, I found there were different shapes there than I was used to playing, and so that was like a kind of a cool way of working on that. I think it's kind of hard to say. Like they may be helpful, they may not be helpful. What I will say is that similar to voice etudes, there are many more classical instrumental etudes than there are jazz or contemporary etudes that have been written. And so maybe this project in some way inspires kind of maybe more instrumentally focused composers to write more etudes. I know that, for instance, Dr. Bergeron is working on an etude collection for bass. So I think this idea is out there. And again, as jazz pedagogy and contemporary music pedagogy continues to mature and continues to grow, hopefully there'll be more and more resources out there, and kind of people will be thinking about this idea of teaching and this idea of making art from like all these different directions, that it's not just kind of one or the other. I hope that answers your question, but I think it would be really cool to see how an instrumentalist might approach these. One final thing I would say, I hope I got to most of your questions, but the final thing I would say is that the big next step for me is to get the etudes into these four etudes in particular into the hands of real people, so real teachers and real students and real musicians, and besides just me, just more people. And get a sense of what works, what doesn't work, what's unclear, what's clear, what I should do more of, all of that kind of stuff, so get some feedback. So I'd really love it if any of you are interested to maybe take a deeper look at these etudes, and let me know what you think about them. I'm really excited to use these with my own students when that time comes. And if anybody needs something transposed to a different key or has any questions, please just let me know. I'm more than happy to help in any way I can. So that concludes my presentation. The conversation doesn't have to stop here. Uh, I'm tempted to do the classic like YouTube thing where if you like this video, please subscribe and like it, because I hope to be making more videos and maybe going to each etude more specifically and kind of talking about it. So please keep the conversation going and stay in touch. And thank you all for joining me. And I mean, at this time, I hope everybody stays safe, and I hope everybody stays healthy. And if anybody needs anything, please let me know. Okay, have a great day, everybody.